All right, one of the most common questions I get specifically about fearful avoidant is if using a no contact rule can actually make them lose feelings. And this is especially relevant since we found some new research that kind of says that too long of a no contact rule can actually cause your chances to get a fearful avoidant back to lessen. So how do we tell that your ex is actually a fearful avoidant? Well, we're going to do this by looking at 3 specific criteria. Number 1, the actual percentage of fearful avoidants out there. Number 2, the upbringing of a fearful avoidant. And number 3, the core wound of a fearful avoidant. All right, let's tackle the percentages first. According to the Attachment Project, the fearful avoidant attachment style really only occurs in about 7% of the population and typically develops in the first 18 months of life. So basically, fearful avoidant exes aren't the norm. Statistically speaking, your ex is most likely not going to be a fearful avoidant. They're going to probably be more dismissive. But let's say that you believe your ex is a fearful avoidant. The second data point that you should be paying attention to is their childhood. Once again, pulling from the Attachment Project, fearful avoidant attachment develops in children when caregivers exhibit contrasting and unpredictable behavior. The caregivers might show contrasting behavior towards how they parent the child. For example, they may be highly loving at times, but on other occasions they may not even meet the most basic needs of the child. As a result, this creates a sense of fear within a child for their own safety. So really pay attention to your ex's childhood. If they were neglected severely or they have a really messed up childhood, this lends credence to the fearful avoidant theory. And then we come to the final aspect of diagnosing a fearful avoidant, which is the core wound. And this is going to be really important to pay attention to for our discussion with regards to the no contact rule a little bit later. So I've stated numerous times that every insecure attachment has a core wound. So for example, an anxious individual is going to have a core wound where they are afraid of abandonment. An avoidant individual is going to have a core wound where they value independence. It just so happens that the fearful avoidant is that one special case where they literally have both core wounds. And this is often why you'll see crazy mood swings with fearful avoidants in relationships. And sometimes even why they're mischaracterized as having multiple personality disorder. Now, to prove this point or help you better understand how this anxious side and avoidant side and how these core wounds can get triggered within a fearful avoidant, I'd like to play a game. What you see right now is a very rudimentary graphic that I put together. Basically, this graphic is an overview of how a fearful avoidant will typically handle a breakup. And you can see it's very similar to my relationship death wheel that I use on dismissive avoidance. You see, just like the death wheel, this has 8 specific stages. The avoidant side triggering, suppression through distraction, going to extremes, rarely rebounding, the anxious side getting triggered, passive-aggressive reach-outs, the actual reach-out, and the anxious nurturing stage. And then, of course, you go back to the top of the cycle again, and it just can revolve around and around among relationship to relationship. But what the heck do each of these stages mean? So we're going to start at the top of the cycle with the avoidance side getting triggered. Usually the sense of the loss of independence will cause the fearful avoidant to break up with you. Sometimes we do see situations where the anxious side gets triggered and that's what starts the cycle, but more likely than not the avoidance side gets triggered. Next, we have the suppression through distraction phase. And this is the first thing they're going to do after they go through a breakup. They're going to suppress their emotions by distracting themselves. This means they could go out all the time, binge Netflix, drink a lot. You get the idea. Then we have going to extremes. Now there's almost an overcorrection at play here. Those distractions, they go to literal extremes. So maybe your ex would work out once a week, but now they're working out twice a day, consistently throughout the entire week. They're doing stuff that they've never done before to an extreme level. Then we have almost a detour stop here in the rare rebound phase. And this is really an extension of the distraction phase, except they're going on the rebound to suppress their emotions. But here's the good news. This tends to be on the rarer side for fearful avoidance. Yes, it can happen. We definitely need to acknowledge it within the cycle, but it is going to be rare. Now, usually after they've gone through all of this stuff and it doesn't work, well, that's where the anxious side is going to get triggered. But here's the misunderstanding that I think most people have about fearful avoidance. They think that it's as simple as a light switch turning on and off. And maybe from the outside looking in, that's what it appears to look like to you, but internally that's not at all usually how it feels to the fearful avoidant. So when their anxious side gets triggered, it's kind of light. They'll start reminiscing. Those emotions that they've been suppressing slowly bubble their way to the surface, and eventually they'll reach the passive-aggressive reach-out stage. So rather than directly reaching out to you, they're going to post something on social media usually that is a direct reference to you. That's a passive-aggressive attempt at communication. So something like this. Relationships are like glass. Sometimes it's better to leave them broken than try to hurt yourself by putting it back together. Something that's usually a direct dig at you without actually being a direct dig at you. Then they'll actually reach out to you. This is the reach out stage. This is where they break down and actually reach out to you. Their anxious side has taken full control. Next, we have the seeking of nurturing stage. And this stage is really going to be the crux of my argument for how the no contact rule and fearful avoidance are going to interact with one another. So what typically happens when the anxious side takes control is that it's going to start seeking validation. They're going to start seeking nurturing. So if you're doing a no contact rule on them and this stage gets triggered and you don't nurture them when they need to feel nurtured, guess what happens? They're actually going to withdraw into themselves and start the cycle again over from the top, but except this time it will take longer for that anxious side to get triggered. So in my opinion, if you're going to use a no contact rule on a fearful avoidant, it always needs to be a little bit on the shorter side. But I guess I really haven't answered the question that this video is really about. Will the no contact rule make a fearful avoidant lose their feelings for you? Honestly, I think that's a tricky thing to answer. See, I think the more a fearful avoidant is allowed to go through the cycle that I just showed you, the more likely they are to move on. As a general rule, we want them to go through that cycle one time. That actually can be healthy for them in a weird way. But if you start going into the realm of 2, 3, 4 times, it's a little like breaking the no contact rule. It becomes less effective each and every time, except instead of the no contact rule being less effective, well, the fearful avoidant becomes more avoidant and they withdraw into themselves further and further and further. So yes, you absolutely need to be careful with the no contact rule and fearful avoidance. It's important not to do a long period of no contact. But here's the good news. 70% of the exes that come through our program have dismissive avoidant tendencies. Very, very rarely do we end up finding a true fearful avoidant. What most likely you're going to have is a dismissive avoidant with a few fearful tendencies, with a few little anxious tendencies here and there. With those kind of exes, you actually want to do longer periods of no contact. One final thing. Fearful avoidants are actually among the easiest exes to get back. The trick with fearful avoidance isn't necessarily getting them back. It's more about keeping them once you've gotten them back.